E aí, galera, bonjour à tous. Hello, everybody. Hope you are doing awesome. Hope you are doing great. I'm really happy to do this today. Let me just turn on our faces here so you can see myself and Nathan just beside me. And I'm really happy to be here with you guys today. I was waiting for this talk quite a long, and having this guy here means a lot for me because I've been learning as you guys learning with this guy for the past, I don't know, 10 years or so, or for the past 7 years, at least when I started to look into pattern labs, then style guides, and after design systems. So he's been around for a long time already, long way before we start talking on design systems. And as long as he's humble and he says that he's not the one that brings the flag, and because it existed already before, but I think Nathan Curtis is the one that I think popularized or is the reference today, nowadays, in when the matter is design systems. Of course, we have other great players or great people talking about it, but I think you are a pioneer. So welcome here, Nathan Curtis. Thank you so much for being here with us, man.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Awesome. And everyone, I know that we have lots of people subscribed to this live, so take 2 minutes and go ahead and send your friends a message. Hey, it started. They are really there. It's true. It is really Nathan Curtis that is live with the guys. So invite your friends over. We have a few questions for you guys. Huge shout out for Brazilians, for French people that are here with us. So invite our friends over, and we are about to start. It will be really good. If you have questions, don't hesitate. Put the questions on the chat right here besides. And as you've seen, we have other awesome events coming on the next weeks to come. So please subscribe to the channel while we still are here. So I think that's pretty much it. We have tons of people already getting here. And please invite your friends over while we can go ahead and start. And Nathan, the stage is all yours, my friend.
Thank you, Tiago. And I want to thank you. I appreciate the invitation to come in and talk about design systems. And in particular, we're going to talk about contributions to design systems with your group. Really, it's nice to be here. So should I start sharing and dig into the content?
Perfect.
All right. Well, we've got a presentation. We'll call this Design System Contributions. And it's really full of what I've experienced over the past 5 or 6 years in design systems, but in particular, started asking questions of why this is so hard later last year in 2019. And did a lot of interviews with some of the other wonderful members of the community out there working on design systems like I do, and collected a lot of input, and as an output is this talk. Just to give you a little bit of sense of who I am, hi, I'm Nathan Curtis. I live in Washington, D.C., or just outside of Washington, D.C. in Virginia. If you've ever heard of Dulles Airport, you might hear a plane as I talk. But I started 8Shapes in 2006 and with Dan Brown, and I've been doing design systems ever since. And my day-to-day life is I tend to lead 1 or 2 design systems at a time as almost a lead of the project from a design perspective, a bit from the technical perspective, but mostly serving as a product manager at this point and helping designers and developers make good components and make good systems and operate how it all works. Some people come across my work via writing that is on Medium. It's on 8shapes.com too, but I write a lot about a wide range of things, not just visual style and components and making good features, but also how it works, how you do processes, and how you form teams and so on. One of the things that I've always believed is that as we started talking about design systems in 2015, using that term really prominently, we began to realize that a style guide is like an artifact you produce, you put it on a shelf, you hand it off to somebody else, but a design system is a living, breathing thing. It's continuing to evolve over time. And as a result, lots of teams, as they migrated to this mindset of products and thinking of products with roadmaps and customers and maintenance and all these other concerns beyond just develop the feature, that created a good mindset to approach design systems too. But really, when we talk about customers of a design system, we talk about designers and developers making digital experiences. And so these give rise to contribution ideas. I've had so many conversations with designers and developers that use design systems I work on, and they say, hey, I made something, it's really awesome. I think it should go in the system. And so what's my answer for that? Because that really is them feeling strong enough that they've got the potential for a contribution to the system. But then we have to really tease apart what that word contribution means. And when you think about contribution, to me, contribution to the system isn't reviewing someone else's pull request to give them feedback, although you could measure that kind of thing. It's not suggesting an example in a meeting just as a fleeting thought or idea. It's not really providing critique. It's not really, to me, attending a meeting, asking a question in Slack. It's not using the system. You're not contributing to the system when you're doing those things. Those are all essential things. Those are all things that have value. But when I use the term contribution, I try to distinguish it from participating in the program, and instead try to make contribution more tangible. And when I think about contribution, I tend to define it as it's design, code, or documentation. Those are the three primary outputs of a design system. And it's something along the lines of fixing something, enhancing something, or creating something new altogether. And when it's a contribution, it's not by someone on a core team. Typically, design systems these days are supported by a core group of maintainers, and it's their job to curate the contributions of everyone else. Absolutely, they are themselves contribution, but when you think about, or contributors, but when you think about the workflows that go into this, it's really them helping other people create things that get released for everybody to reuse, that because it's a shared need. And so when we think about why these contributions matter, there's a lot of reasons. When I did these interviews across the teams I was working with, as well as 10 other design systems last fall, a few people said, yeah, it's to develop skills. They look at a design system as one way to learn how to make things with rigor, and by contributing something to that growing system, they grow their own skill sets to become a better designer and developer. Or it helps via all these outside influences from the customers of a design system, the system itself to adapt over time. Certainly, contributions increase the level of inclusiveness in a design system program. It makes people that are using the system and having good ideas and being able to build it up and scale the work feel like they are a part of that process. But contributions also help generate alignment too. You have group 1, 2, and 3 all working on something that actually group 4 has already made. So can group 4 generate alignment by contributing that thing and giving access to the other 3 groups? That sense of ownership is important in a system. You know, people use terms like in the United States, the Constitution of the people, by the people, for the people. And when you think about the people, everyone, not just the core team, should feel like they own the system because it's a foundation to everybody's work to create a digital experience. It increases representation across lines of business and platforms, essentially reducing the isolation of a core team that might not have visibility to everything. But the top 2 reasons, number 2 is productivity. You just generate more stuff. We want more. There's an opportunity to have more that more people can share. But actually, the key theme, the number 1 theme was advocacy. When a person contributes, they learn more how the system works. They've invested themselves. And by doing so, they can disseminate that belief and really evangelize and advocate for how the system works to a lot of their coworkers. And so you get this network effect, essentially, to teach and grow the system beyond just the core maintainers that do it themselves. And so contributions can take a variety of different sizes from different types of people. If you're a designer, a small contribution might be you made a new icon. You're going to throw it into the system because it's a good one for everybody to use. Or a large contribution for a designer might be they're creating a new filter pattern, and it takes a number of different components and puts them all together in an interesting way. For a developer, a small contribution might be a 1-line code fix. Maybe there's some IE11 defect that they can fix and quickly get it in and take that contribution and put it right back into their own product quickly. Or it might be a developer creating a new layout grid structure with rows, columns, breakpoints, offsets, all those things that create a layout grid. And contributions aren't limited to designers and engineers. There are other people too, accessibility specialists, researchers, or in this case, a content strategist that might write another sentence for a guideline or might have a new place to publish their 1,000 word list glossary that they have for all the common terms to be used in a digital experience. And so that puts us on a spectrum of size. How big, how complex, how costly, how effortful is the contribution? And on one end, if you're creating a new component, for example, a new card component, it's a new feature. It doesn't exist in the system yet. And on the other end, like I was talking about before, it's a fixing of a defect. And then those are actually the easy ones to discern. The thing on the left, the defect fix, needs to be quick, needs to go back in. It's really fairly low effort. The thing on the right, it's brand new. It's probably going to need to go through a lot of different conversations and reviews and presentations. The stuff in the middle, though, is harder to optimize for. If you have a small enhancement, like a card component that you want to add 2 new types of background colors, or a large enhancement that you want to create variants of a card for specific scenarios, like a product card or a blog post card. And so as you think about those, that actually, there's even bigger contributions that people talk about, but frankly, don't get contributed in this sort of mindset. If you're going to create a new feature like a scaling of every single component across your catalog, or you're going to completely reinvent via major initiative your entire front-end framework. Yeah, someone could contribute that, but that I've never seen it happen outside of a core team. A core team is always involved. They're always doing a lot of the core work, et cetera. And that's just going to change the foundation. And so we want to return back to the first 4 things, because the system team, the bigger and more complex the initiative, the less likely it's going to be a contribution. And so instead, let's move back to this basic scale and talk about how frequently these contributions happen. Defect fixes, small little cuts, small changes, especially for developers, happen a lot more frequently than small enhancements, and then large enhancements than new features. There's a relationship between the size of the contribution and how often it occurs. And so you think about the different steps involved for a contribution to happen. One of the things we use at 8Shapes is a set of steps that we go through to deliver a new feature, from proposing it to designing it to coding it, documenting it, and ultimately releasing it or publishing it. For a defect fix, design's not even involved. It's a quick effort for a coder or a developer to submit the pull request and then ultimately have that pull request merged and released through the system. For a small enhancement, though, those 2 background colors for the card, you got to get design involved a little bit. You got to propose it, and maybe the proposal process is a 5-minute conversation or a meeting that you have. A bit of design work, but then there's more code, and you need to document it. You need to help people understand what that is. If you get into a large enhancement like those variants, suddenly the design cost is starting to increase considerably. The code cost is starting to increase. If you're going to create a card from scratch, suddenly there's a lot of design, there's a lot of code, there's quite a bit of documentation. And so you see that the cost of the contribution is also going to increase. And it's also noticed across multiple disciplines that you're going to have to not only have multiple disciplines to do the work, but they're going to have to collaborate together. And so you think about this relationship, what's the frequency versus a level of effort? And clearly they're in opposition to one another. The more frequent, the quicker or lower level of effort it's going to be. And so frequency versus rarity of a contribution is one dimension, but another thing is how self-directed should the contribution feel? For defect fixes, if you have a developer that knows how to fix a bug and they can submit a pull request, it should be almost effortless for them to do it and very quick for them to turn around. When you think about they have a fix, they're going to want that fix and turn it very fast right back around and integrate it into their product. As opposed to, on the other hand, if it's a new feature, they're going to need to be stewarded, and I'll talk about that. Stewarded means the degree to which someone more familiar with the system helps guide a contributor through the process, through a lot of the steps, and may do some of the steps for them. And it might be, or it certainly almost always is, slower, but it doesn't have to be slow per se. And so as you think about these different pieces, business as usual on the left, if you're creating a contribution process for your design system, I would focus on the left first. How can you make quick contributions, frequent contributions, really require a limited amount of effort, be very clear, and be very satisfying to the contributor? Versus on the right-hand side, there's going to be more steps, there's going to be more collaboration, there's going to be more alignment that you're going to need across all of your different stakeholders and across the different disciplines that do it. And so that will require far more guidance in stewarding, and don't anticipate that you're going to be able to create one size fits all, because these things are hard. Contributions are hard. And when you take a look at what you have in a design system, one of the things I do when I come into a new system program is I take a look at their core design process. There are 5 steps, for example, like you saw on a previous slide. We propose it, then we design it, we code it, we document it, we release it. And design system programs are pretty good at defining what this is, and it's actually very clear to see it in programs like Jira, where they manage all of their work. But then I see design system leads create a contributor process, and they start to think deeply about it. And they're like, oh, wait, well, if this one thing happens, we're going to bridge off to this one. Well, but then if we go, and then this contributor is going to need to do this other thing. And so we have all these other aspects of the workflow, and then they're going to go off in this one step, but ultimately they might kind of converge and have this thing together. And I'm just mystified. I'm like, why is there such a distinction? To me, it's a challenge to think, why isn't a contributor going through some of the same steps and checking the same boxes that someone on a core team would check to do the same kind of thing? In fact, as I look at it, that really speaks to a lot of the challenges that emerged with contributions. Contributors sometimes, or in a lot of design system programs, have a hard time getting started because they do things a different way, and the process is vaguely documented. And it's really daunting. They look at all these different things and they see the complexity and they just don't know where to start. But they also have a challenge because typically contributors come from design or development and not a pair. And so if you have a designer, who's going to code their thing? If you have a developer with an idea, do they necessarily have the design at a place where it's sort of normalized? And is it going to align with the workflow that they do? How does their process on their team map to the process that the system team uses? How can you align the delivery of a thing through a system so that they can use it in their own product too? And so there's a bevy of challengers. But the 3 key questions that arise are how they do their work on their team, because they come with a mental model of, I work on this squad, we have our normal ways of operating, and now I want to contribute something to that effort, which has a different way of operating. How do they make things on that team? Is it really responsible for me to do every step of the process for that team? And do I need to make my thing at their level of quality for it to be good enough? I won't belabor the details of these diagrams, but I will say, like, when we break down our process into steps, something like fixing a defect really runs through a series of small subtasks, if you want to think about it that way, small things that developers do to create a branch in code, compose the HTML style and script as necessary, maybe update a test or two, maybe update the dependents that use this component, then run the tests through the testing suite, like unit tests and test functionality and test visual regression and so on, and get that pull request reviewed by a developer or two, write the change log, merge the code. All of these things for someone who is going through a fairly lightweight process that they're familiar with might take 15 to 30 minutes to actually do a very small change. This should be a quick and easy process. But oh my gosh, there's already 13 substeps for me to think about. There actually are a lot of things that could be missed. And so when you think about the design of a new feature or a large enhancement, when you look at the design process, suddenly we're looking at, oh, we need to set up files from a template, we need to integrate existing assets, we need to design the feature, we need to align it with design tokens, we need to test it for accessibility and usability, although rarely system teams test usability. We present it to a bunch of people, we get it reviewed by a bunch of people, and then we finalize and deliver it. And the reality is, for a product designer not on the system core team, they do a lot of the green stuff in their own team, but they don't necessarily do the red stuff. They don't think about design tokens. They don't think about presenting to the design community. They just present to their teammates, make a thing, and push it out. And so there are extra steps that they don't necessarily do themselves. And actually, some of the steps, they don't necessarily do at a level of quality or robustness that a system team does. Do they test accessibility of every single thing that goes out in their product, having it go through a formal accessibility review? Do they design not just their feature because it's going on a white background in a fairly dense user interface, but actually design it so it works across all the color backgrounds that you support. Dark mode, that it also works if you have a larger array of UI interface elements, that it meets those cases that may not be relevant to your situation. And you have all these things reviewed. And so you look at the stuff they don't traditionally do, and you look at the stuff that they don't necessarily do as robustly, and suddenly contributing to a system that everybody's going to use is going to be a challenge. The same thing for developers. There's a lot of things when you're making a new feature and you're coding it that you go through. Certainly you start it, you create a branch, you generate files, etc. You write and compose all the different things. You have to create an API. And then you have a lot of tests that not only you just lightly update for defect, but you actually have to create from scratch. Unit tests, test browsers and devices, test functionality, and then all the presenting and reviewing and so on. Much heavier process. And so when you think about developers, there are a lot of things they may not do in their own work on their squad because it doesn't matter to any but other squads. They don't need to review their API with a bunch of other developers on other teams. They don't need to run unit tests because their team doesn't do unit testing. They don't do visual regression testing. There are things that they don't necessarily do in their team. And there are other things that they may not do as rigorously either. When they're drafting an API, that conversation might be discussed verbally with teammates for 20 minutes, as opposed to written up in a manner that you can distribute in a Word doc or a Google Doc to a lot of other developers to give you feedback on it. And so as you think about the rigor that you need to go through with development, that's also a challenge. There are other reasons people don't want to contribute. Two of the key ones that elevated, the first one was, do I have what it takes? A lot of people drawn to systems are more senior people. They have a systems mindset. They understand how everything fits together. And so you have oftentimes a lot of other people in the community that don't have the experience level or don't have the belief that they can build something that robustly. And so what do you need to do with those folks? You need to train and pair with them. You need to be prepared as a design system program, not to just create more components, but essentially be coaches and help people along. The other one on the right-hand side is an even greater risk, which Amy Hugh from gov.uk at the time really helped me see. They're putting themselves out visibly when a contributor says, I want to contribute a layout grid. Suddenly the design system's talking about it. Suddenly a lot of other teams are thinking about it. And suddenly that person's got a spotlight on them. They're making something really consequential, and they're going to go into this forum where a lot of people might not agree with them. And so it's up to the system team, the people working on that core team, to moderate that collaboration, maintain a positive environment, and really guide that contributor through and facilitate all those conversations for them, so the person can focus on the thing they're making and not necessarily all the community engagement that the system team member may be more capable of doing themselves. And so that gets at who's helping, who's this guide you're talking about? Two words came up most commonly. One word was shepherd. And what shepherd means is guide a person in a particular direction, especially in spiritual matters. It invokes a bit of religion to it that makes some people uncomfortable. But the other word, particularly Shopify, Polaris, is a team that uses the term steward. And so steward is a person employed to manage another's property. That's really what a design system is doing. They're curating or stewarding a system that everybody is sharing. And so when you think about a steward, that's a person on a core team that is going to be paired with or consult or coach with a contributor to help that contributor get their work done. It might take 15 minutes. It might take iteration over weeks to go through all the steps that's necessary to get the work done. Some key things that you want to do as a steward is start with a conversation, not a form. While some design system programs think we need to document everything, we need to publish the whole process on our website, we need to articulate all the steps and sub-steps, just like Nathan's slides 5 slides ago, that's going to potentially intimidate them. What they want as an experience as a contributor to the system isn't some impersonal thing where they have to read tomes and tomes of documentation, but instead they want to call somebody up and say, hey, how does this work? And so when you start with a conversation, it's more welcoming and it's going to invite them in. Certainly it can be triggered by a form or an email or a Slack request if necessary, but treat it like a conversation and be prepared to guide them. When you have that conversation, prep them with what they need to know, but not more. You might tell them, yes, you're going to start by creating a branch and you're going to compose these things. Later on, you're going to need to test things. And then we're going to do a pull request and you'll have a few people look at it. But let's start on creating a branch. Let's focus on what's in front of us now. Let's start with step one. Because if you overwhelm them, that's going to diminish their interest in having to go through all the steps or feel like they have to remember everything. Also, provide templates. Have examples handy. Not examples of go look at the documentation site, but instead show them what the artifacts look like. If you're a designer and you're coming in, don't just give me a blank sketch file with a big white artboard. Show me what it looked like when the first person contributed the product card and what actually they had to annotate and create as specs and how they reviewed different audited examples from other design systems. And oh, I see the kinds of things that they did because I see the artifacts and I see how it works. And I have a sketch file that I can start from that has all the tools I need as a contributor, not just as a designer. Also, listen for what they believe they can do. You might have a designer that's actually quite capable of doing front-end development. If they're capable of creating some new design tokens, creating a visual regression test case, and adding a bit of markup and a prop value, then encourage them to do so. Just because they have the title designer doesn't mean they're not capable of doing some front-end development. And the same thing can be said of an engineer. If an engineer is capable of thinking through design alternatives and suggesting color choices from a palette that already exists, there's no reason to say you're a developer, stay in your lane, don't do a design system contribution. It's up to you as a steward to build cadence, check in, and avoid stalling. That might just be a few emails back and forth, or if it's a larger enhancement or new feature, that might mean every couple of weeks you're checking in. Hey, how's the layout grid going? Hey, have you created that prototype yet? Are you ready to show it to the community? If not, okay, let's take another couple of weeks and then we'll put you on the schedule after that. It's really up to you as a steward to maintain the pace of the work for them. And then it's up to you as a steward also to manage the community. As a member of the core team, you know how everybody interacts. You know what all the different types of meetings are. You know how to get on the schedule of not just a design critique that other designers attend, but also get on the schedule of the head of design that needs to see these things. And so you manage those interactions for them and help them understand what they need to have and where they need to be when. When you're having conversations about contributions, you also have to have the conversation of, does this thing belong in the system anyway? Because sometimes they don't. The first question is it a shared need? Because if it's only for your product, so the contributor made something that's really relevant to them, but it's not relevant to anyone else, why are we putting it in the space that everybody else reuses stuff? If it's useful for one other product, well, let's chat about that. There might be some validity there. 3 products is my rule of thumb. Let's poke the design system community on Slack and see if there's a need for this. Let's talk about 5 products. Okay, a lot of different teams need this. It probably belongs in the system, depending on some other factors like cost and effort and time and so on. Also, is it consistent with things you've made in the system? If you already have a modal, an alert, a notification, an inline error, those are different ways to capture the attention of a user within a page-based experience and for something that they wouldn't otherwise have noticed. And now you want to create a dialogue. And that's actually different from a modal because a dialogue is narrow, it's smaller, it might have a field or two, and it's really going to provoke you to click on one button or the other to proceed with something. Okay, that's consistent with everything else. We don't have that in the system today. That'd be a great addition to the system. Also, you have to think about the cost to make and maintain something. On the far left, every system has an input. Most systems have some sort of date input, and often as far as even a date picker. But if you're trying to create a date range picker that also includes price, such as a hotel room, for each of the given nights, across a two-month span, that might not be something that everybody needs. That's also really expensive, or it could be more expensive. There's a lot more data integration. You have to think about, if you're going to put this in the system, not just US dollars, but Japanese yen, which might be 5 or 6 digits long. Is that going to work in this display? Are you going to design for that kind of scale? Because if you're using a system for our company that has hotel rooms across the world, it needs to have yen in there too. Or could you just turn it off so it's only United States dollars and a few other currencies? Suddenly the person's like, I didn't even want to have these conversations. That's not really a contribution that I'm willing to make. Where do you exist on something that needs to be in the system or not? Also, if you don't have a certain type of feature and it's going to trigger growth into other types of features, such we don't have a tooltip, but once we make a tooltip and we deal with where the notch goes and we deal with the layering and we deal with edge detection, making a popover that's sort of a tooltip with a more generic content space in it, that's not that hard to add. And then we can take our list items, put it in the popover, and suddenly we've got a menu list, essentially a menu component that combines a button with a popover to make some sort of selection. Oh, okay, wow, if we start with tooltip, the next two things aren't going to be nearly as expensive. And so there's a lot of opportunity there. My friend Adam Rowe, he's from Morningstar Design System, uses a challenge question. Actually, when someone says, I want to add motion to the design system, Adam asks, well, how much can you really document it? How much of an expert are you on? Motion's like a fundamental thing. And so are you going to make something like you see on the left, like Google Material has? And then the person says, whoa, I am not a motion expert. I'm just thinking, can we get some sort of link color transition timing and start to use that across the products? Okay, suddenly we've changed what their better understood what their real ambition is, not to blow out a whole new dimension of the system as motion, but instead just start to share a few core values as a starting point, because that's what they're capable of. Lastly, it's about how much time they have. A person working as a contributor answers not to the design system. They answer to the team they're on. They often have tribal affinity for the team they're on and doesn't want to let their team down. And so anytime they have investing and making something for the system that isn't going to be of necessarily value to their team, they might not be able to give that time. And so you have to have honest conversations around, okay, how long until you're going to be able to turn around this designer code? A week? Let's get started. Great. I love this. A month? Let's start to think about the milestones. Let's start to block out the work. A quarter? Okay, that's starting to move slower. How is this really fitting with your other commitments? I'm starting to get a little leery. Is it going to take you a year to do this? Let's discuss this another time. It's almost a rule of thumb that if they say a month, they really mean a quarter. If they say a quarter, be prepared for it to take over a year. I've seen it take over a year. And actually about 6 or 9 or 10 months into it, a design system team might say, we were waiting for that contributor to do it. They never did it. Everybody else needs it. We're going to make it ourselves. And then you start to have the potential for uncomfortable conversations because the contributor is not going to do the work anymore. Once you decide a feature is going to go in the system, how much of that feature needs to be designed and built? And so you need to think to yourself, what's the minimum viable component, essentially? Because if they propose a card on the far left, what else needs to be in the card for it to be viably reused across many other teams? Just a title and an image? Probably not. Maybe you also need a description or a category, or maybe categories with icons because you, in your particular digital experience, have icons paired with category names, or different aspect ratios of images like square image, or maybe a variant where you don't have any image at all. Is that allowed? And so you start to think about what of these features do you have to have in order for the contribution of a card to feel enough that you can put it in the system and it's going to be resilient to change and growth, rather than you put something in the system and suddenly, oh, the aspect ratio is going to change. Because at times people have different beliefs on what kind of aspect ratio it needs. And so when you run into contributions, there might be someone proposing, a contributing designer proposing a card on the far left. But then another designer says, well, ours is more of a creation interface. So we want to put the edit button right on the image because really everything's invoked and associated with the image. We want the edit button on the image. That's going to be where it has the greatest impact. And then a third designer says, actually, we have multiple interactions we need to handle with our card. And so we need to use icons for that. And so how do you get these folks to agree? How do you stoke a conversation in your design community as a fourth person, a steward, to say, okay, designers 1, 2, and 3, what should the card be then? Because we need a card in the system. And so what you can do is actually facilitate and look for areas that they agree. Can we all agree we need to have a standard aspect ratio? Yes. Can we all agree that we need a description, a title, and an image? Yes. Can we agree that maybe we don't have to be very opinionated on where the action goes, but instead maybe we'll put a little action slot at the bottom. You can put a button in there. We have buttons. You can put icons in there. We already have icon buttons. And so you can put whatever combination of those things you want in the base of the card. And for the person that wants to put edit on the top of the image, we don't do that anywhere. So let's have another conversation about that. And so suddenly the card is starting to take shape with the things people agree on. But even as the contributor finishes that card, it still might need to be normalized with system conventions. They might not be completely equipped to know how to apply space. Their border radius might be 2 pixels instead of 4 pixels. They might not know that category names need to be text transformed to be capitalized. They might have chosen the wrong kind of background color. And so how can you be prepared as a design system team to anticipate there's going to be this normalization to make whatever they're contributing consistent with the system? This is a pretty bad example. Like the card on the left is not even close. But other times you really need to be nitpicky with the details and pay attention, because if you don't, you'll put something out there that gets reused, and suddenly that inconsistency starts to spread. Lastly, you want to praise contributors. Once they're done with the process, once they finish their design and they finish their code, or they finish their documentation, or what if they did all three? Praise them, because they're now a contributor that created an increased amount of value in the system. There's all sorts of ways you can praise them. In the operations of a system, there's typically a Slack channel. How can you mention them? Maybe multiple times. We released this thing, and then two weeks later, oh, we just saw the mentioned contributors' work used in this other product. And suddenly you're creating connections between your community that's really praising that particular person. Publishing their name on a documentation site, including them in an email announcement that your leadership reads, thinking about how the release history is involved. There's lots of different ways to really elevate contributors. One of the ways that really worked well for us at Morningstar, when I worked with that team, in fact, we had bi-weekly sprint reviews or demos that would have anywhere from at Morningstar around 30 people, at Fidelity got up to 100 people. We would always have the contributors present first in the first 10 minutes. There might be one 5-minute slot, another 5-minute slot. Suddenly we're putting them on the stage first for everybody to see how their work's going. So treat your contributors well. There's a lot more I could talk about with contributions, but hopefully that's given you some inspiration to how to think about contributions. And I hope we have some time for questions.
Sure, we do. And what amazing content. Thank you so much. What is really interesting is that we have several of the agile principles that you apply actually for the reality of the design systems. For example, having the individuals over contracts. So don't make people read the documentation, because nobody's going to read it. It's really amazing. I had a blast, a really great insight when you were talking about the small contribution and the large contribution. In our case, we are developing a design system here with the team from France. So, hey guys from Mosaic, we had a problem because we started to try to make contributors build the whole new feature. So we had the documentation, we had this workflow, we had the suggestions, the kickoff, doing conversations, but what we were expecting from them was a lot, and they had the learning curve for them to join and to contribute on something is huge, so it creates a little bit of frustration. So really great content, and I'm more than happy. Also, the other thing that you said that struck me in a good way is like visualize the work, right? So let's make things visible. In this way, we will be able to figure out what we're gonna do, focusing on work and not on the people. So another amazing, and also when we're talking about breaking the silos and we're talking about multidisciplinary teams, and you say if a designer wants to code, encourage them. So really awesome thoughts and insights, Nathan. And I'm more than happy to open to some questions here. Though I'm going to start with the questions that we have people asking previously. For you to know, we had like more than 40 questions popping, and we had this voting session on Miro, where we have the more the most voted questions. The first
Awesome.
one would be, yeah, what is the best format for approval or of components and standards when the design team is not the same as the product team? So I think you talk a little bit about that. So the,
What
the,
is the best what?
the workflow for approving a new contribution, a new pattern that is coming from a team that is not the core team, actually.
I don't know if there's a precise workflow, but I would say there are important steps. The first important step is that actually the design system has visibility of the things it's going to work on. And so when contributors look at a design system, they need to see, oh, actually that's number 6 on the list that they're going to work on next. I don't need to worry about that. Or I don't see it on the list. Maybe I should suggest it. So the visibility of their roadmap is one thing that is really valuable. The second thing is when the conversation starts, frame out what the scope of the contribution is. And it doesn't need to be really formal. Typically, I'll find myself doing a basic bulleted listing exercise with a description and a JIRA ticket that has 4 bullets, 8 bullets, 12 bullets, and you start to frame out like the boundaries of what this contribution really is meant to be and what it's not meant to be. This is not X, Y, and Z. The third thing is you really want to ensure that you have a good understanding of related work that could overlap with that. And that's a really hard one. Visibility across all the different teams is difficult. And so for better or worse, the best way is to actually provide visibility of the potential contribution and have other people self-select to say, I'm doing something similar, rather than contributors are definitely not going to audit. They've got too much work to do. You can't tell a contributor, great, look at the other 49 teams' work going on and see if they're going to use this or not. They're not in that game. Lastly, I find value in both presentations and reviews. I'll start with reviews. If there's a way for you to have some forum, it might be a Google Doc that people share. It might be an Envision document, somewhere where other people can see it and comment on it. That's important because that is an open area of communication that anybody is welcome to contribute to. But also presenting the work is important. And I find that the healthiest design systems in the design org are associated with healthy and predictable design critique of designers across work streams. And so when that occurs, there's a natural place for this kind of proposal to fit in as an item to discuss. I'd include all those in your workflow.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And it's really interesting because, yeah, again, visualizing the thing, right? And demoing constantly. That reminds me what you talked about having the contributors passing first. I think that's a really good trick to make people more engaged. Really cool. There's a second question here, more related to testing components, because this person is asking, okay, how can I test the components? Because I'm currently just using A/B tests to validate or invalidate the components that are going to be on the design system.
So there's a variety of ways that you can test components. And really it comes down to what kind of questions are you trying to answer. Every component in our standard process goes through an accessibility test during a design phase, during a code phase, and frankly, often during a documentation phase. And so there's an accessibility element to all of those. And in particular in development, manual testing, automated testing, et cetera. I think the testing you're talking about, though, is the efficacy of a component. Is it doing its job? Do people understand it? Is it usable? And so the question that arises is, who does that testing? It's very, very rare that the design system team themselves are going to set up an entire study to test a component. I think what your question or the person asking the question is doing right is testing it in a localized context first, learning about its efficacy, and then making a judgment whether that's enough, or if you need to run tests in other local areas before it's going to bubble up to or promote into a best practice at the system level. I like doing a lot of stuff centrally in design systems, but one thing I love to federate most is testing and validation of things like that.
Yeah, pretty amazing. There's, yeah, as you said, A/B testing is just one of the ways we can do it, right? So
Mhm.
Pretty interesting stuff. I'm gonna read a question from the chat here. So I have the Lucas asking, I'm currently working on developing a design system. What is the best way to categorize components and name them so every designer or developer could easily understand? That's a pretty interesting question.
How to name components?
Naming conventions, right?
Okay, I don't have 2 hours to talk about that because it's really, really, really hard.
Yeah.
We can think a lot of names of even really atomic components are easy, but like in that slide I showed, dialogue, alert, notification, modal, like popover, all those things, people, like you look at different design systems, they're using those terms to identify different UI elements. And so what worked about that slide more was that you saw it. And so when you think about names, pairing a name with a picture is important. I'm really cautious about naming also around creating hierarchy in components. I tend to be a pretty flat list person. 85 might be better than 8 groups of 10 components, because there is definitely a common group called form components. Everybody can predict it has checkbox, radio button, input, drop down, etc. But very few people can predict, what am I going to find in the modules components? What am I going to find in the patterns components? What am I going to find in the navigation components? When almost every component has some form of navigation built into it, links, buttons, nav bars, etc. And so when you create abstract terms, you have to be really cautious about what those mean and how people are going to interpret them. Brad Frost and the atomic mindset is something that has opened up the door to design systems for a lot of teams. And so learning and thinking that way is essential. And you also have to be cautious about, not most people know what atomic components are, but you get, what's the difference between molecule and organism? The boundary between those two things can be challenging for some people. And so even the best naming scheme that our field has come up with is not necessarily solving everybody's problem perfectly. It's still better than almost everything else that's come out. So it's a challenge, but it's more about establishing a shared vocabulary and how can you go through that exercise with designers, with engineers, and ideally share that vocabulary across those.
Awesome, thank you. In our case, we were using BEM from CSS, right? Block Element Modifier, and as a framework. What is interesting is that it gets clear, but the problem is that contributors may have another layer of things to learn in order to add namings and stuff like that. So
yeah, even I love them too. That's the clearest model in CSS that I've come across that I'm most comfortable with. But a lot of people don't agree with me, including like contributors. I don't want to use BAM. I want to use object-oriented CSS or whatever their other model is. And suddenly you're dealing with different models, let alone different terms for what an element is called.
Awesome. There's something we were using also. It's we are combining actually BAM with, it's not naming convention anymore, but it's ITCSS, which is starting with from the most generic possible, and then going to the end of the funnel where we're going to add all the modifiers and stuff like that. Have you ever crossed that? I'm sure you did, but do you have something to say about ITCSS?
I don't. I've never used it in practice. Most of the systems I've participated more heavily in naming on have been BIM-based. Or more recently, as I've begun to work more with React, Vue, and Angular-based systems, the conversation isn't necessarily about BEM or CSS naming. It's about the API. And so the API, the props of the component in particular. I'm always a person that's trying to drive towards, well, what are you calling it in the sketch file? What are the names of the layers in Sketch? What are you calling it in your documentation site? And oftentimes, if a design team has one documentation site and a dev team has another documentation site, the hardest thing isn't integrating the two just in terms of a concept, but the hardest thing is, wow, we call our components, some are the same names and some are different names. We call our properties within a component, some names are the same, some are different names, and suddenly somebody has to change in order to bring things together.
Awesome, perfect. I'm in headbanger mode during all this live here, so tomorrow I'm gonna have some neck stuff. There's a random comment. I'm really good in doing bad jokes, so Rodrigo
I
Muniz.
love it.
Rodrigo Muniz has a question, and he's talking as a design system team. What could we avoid? What could we do to avoid being seen as the villains by the designers in a big organization?
That's a tough challenge because with a big organization, first, be prepared that you're going to have a wide range of postures towards the system. You will have people that love it, that are your best friends, that are part of what often becomes some kind of extended team. And you'll have your curmudgeons, your really grumpy people, the people that are never happy. And often when we do discovery for design systems, we tend to interview across that spectrum and focus on the folks with the more challenges. In fact, my teammate Kevin did an interview yesterday, and he said, I just interviewed somebody who was really just didn't like the system and how it was built and all these different features. But then at the end of the conversation said, I still believe in a system. I still want to use it, and it's still going to be the core of what I do. And so you have to get to the beliefs of what they have and really where they're coming from. The other thing is that you have to think about how you're projecting yourself, not just their posture, but what you project. Are you projecting a personality of governance, of policing, of when you get into a conversation, do you lead with, that's not how the system works? Or are you coming to a conversation as an enabling tool? I take the perspective that a system equips other teams to achieve the destiny that those teams choose. And the system works best when those teams are buying into how the system works as a part of that destiny. But I'm not going to tell a team to build a certain way when they have to achieve certain goals, because I don't necessarily understand all of their problems. And so instead of starting with, that's not how the system works, or you're using the wrong thing here, here, and here, you're wrong. Instead, help me understand the difference between how this thing is intended to be used and how you solve that particular problem. Because oftentimes that creates growth rather than distrust and separation.
Amazing, amazing. That's cool because we're starting to get on the soft skill part of using non-violent communication, or thinking more on what is the current need actually behind the behavior, and the thing around believers and non-believers, which is when you address the non-believers, you should be careful on how you are approaching them, because the guys that are right in the middle, if you are too aggressive, they will think of you as, oh, he's rude, so I'm gonna go with the resistant guys because they are the good ones, right? So, yeah, cool. I'm gonna take another question here because I thought it's somehow interesting. It's like when we're talking about the workflow that you've done on your career, which are the things that you've seen that you thought, oh, I was doing like this and I have to change? If you have some like two or three things that you have on your mind, on top of your mind to talk about.
In terms of the workflow, I'd say it's grown. I don't know that much has changed other than some terms that we use, but I've come to really lean on the fact that design systems in the end release three main types of things. Tools for designers like Sketch and Figma, tools for developers like React or HTML and CSS or some sort of code, and documentation that helps you understand how those things work. And so while early on the steps used to be design and code, documentation trails both of those and felt like a viable third step. And so when you have those three steps, I felt like we really had solved the outputs. But then those three steps oftentimes get worked on in parallel rather than 1, 2, and 3. They overlap. And really the point that the step that follows all of them is the release. And so how do you think as a design system program releasing? Do you release all those different things out of synchronization? Or when you release a feature, like 2 new background colors for a card, it's in the doc, it's in the code, it's in your sketch assets. Same time, everybody sees the same thing. And so that synchronization is something that we've worked harder on in more recent years. The other thing is what happens before those steps. And so some teams call it discovery, other teams call it propose, but how do you decide what to do? Essentially, are we going to make this feature? What is this feature going to have? And are we going to start it now or later? You know, you have to answer basic questions before you start doing the core of the work. since like that has grown to be the 5 most common steps, there are a couple others. Do you break out design assets to be different than code as a deliverable? Often you do. Like the sketch versus getting the design done is different than getting the Figma component of that design finalized, for example. But also breaking all those things down into all those tiny sub-steps you saw in those slides. And so grow into your workflow is generally the advice I give. And you can look at diagrams like I have as inspiration to cherry pick the kind of steps you're ready for and the kind of steps that you may grow into later.
Amazing, amazing. We're getting closer to the end of this live, and I'd like just to do a last question for you. The question that popped here right now and on the mural, and how can I have buy-in from my non-designer boss to start to invest on the design system, even if it is working part-time on it? Because it's not just design, right? It's design and code that you would need. So how to get buy-in from a manager that doesn't quite understand the value behind it?
So yeah, it's hard. And so there's 2 aspects to that. The investment that you have that needs to be proven or informed by the things that you do and the ways that you do them. So I wouldn't go to that manager and say, it's time to build a design system. They're gonna be like, what's a design system? We have this product, we make it a certain way. Instead, how can you start to evoke reuse and naming and all the architectural things you can do by designing and coding systematically within the work that you do? How can you start to pull out the systematic parts that can make it very evident to them, oh, that's a reusable thing. Oh, that's creating efficiencies. Oh, that's creating consistency. Suddenly, quality, consistency, and efficiency are things they're thinking about. Those are the top 3 reasons you do a design system. Then you grow into, well, if we want to do this across 5 teams, I'm going to need X amount of time. Oh, now 10 teams depend on us. That's me and a coder full time. And you start to gradually get there. There will be moments when you have a step where suddenly the value is recognized and there's a significant increase in the investment. And that's like, there's usually a stage of, let's form a team to do this. And then at some companies, let's start forming teams of teams to do this. And so you go through stages of growth, but it all starts with designing and building systematically to reveal how it works, and then starting to associate with systems you can show them.
Perfect. That is pretty much good. So once again, thank you so much for being here with us, Nathan. And I learned a lot. There were a few things that I was remembering the articles you wrote and seeing the presentation ring a bell. I mean, I have a little bit of noting things here. So thank you so much about that. Tomorrow is going to be a really interesting day with the team. And guys, if you're here, please subscribe to the channel. We're going to have Jared's pool in 2 weeks. We're going to have next week, we're going to do a portfolio critique session. And after we have Alison Luca directly from New York talking about how to work outside Brazil. So Nathan, again, thank you so much. Any final words, anything you'd like to say to end this up?
No, just thanks a lot for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
Awesome. Same here, man. Thank you so much. And that's it, guys. That's a wrap. Thank you, everybody from the chat. Merci, tout le monde. Obrigado, galera. And thank you, everyone. This is a wrap. Bye, guys. Thank you. Have a great night or a great afternoon if you are in the US, in Brazil, or I don't know. Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone. Let me just close the live.